I'd like to start our conversation with Dr. and Professor Max Abrahms. Professor Dr. Abrams is a political scientist and a leading expert on international security with a specialized focus on counterterrorism. I've known him for many years. He is also a podcast host and prominent commentator on global security issues. Um, Max, I'd love to give you the floor now. If you could give the audience a little more of an introduction about you and have a few questions as well. Thank you for being with us.
Great. Thanks for hosting this. I'll just hop in with the substance of what I wanted to say today, or did you want more sort of biographical background?
Um,
I don't-
would love both a brief biographical background, anything that I hadn't mentioned there. You mentioned a recent fellowship that you had, and also your
Oh,
thoughts on
yeah. I mean, I basically wear two different hats. I mean, my main profession is as a professor at Northeastern, and I do research on international security issues, particularly related to terrorism and counterterrorism. And then, academe can be very far removed from reality and from the world of policy impact. And so I spend a lot of my time trying to inform the public about what's going on in terms of the international extremism landscape. And also, I try to be prescriptively useful by recommending policy responses, particularly for dealing with terrorist groups. And I do that in the media space, giving talks, advising government agencies, and the like.
amazing, amazing. I'd love to get your opening thoughts also about the topic at hand today.
Sure. So let's step back. Some of this will be review, but on April 22nd, there was a mass casualty terrorist attack in Kashmir perpetrated by Pakistan sponsored terrorists, and these were Islamist extremists, absolutely no question about it. We know that because they took hostages and recite, you know, they figured out ways to determine whether the people in their sites were Muslims or not. And if they weren't Muslims, then they were shot. And we also know that this was a Pakistan sponsored group because there was actually a credit claim where the Resistance Front, which is basically uh, a proxy group for Lashkar-e-Taiba, claimed credit for the attack and then tried to walk it back when it became clear how unpopular the attack was. And the reason why it was so unpopular was because it was directed against civilian targets. There were 26 fatalities, all 26 were civilian, 25 of them were Indian. And so the Indian response was unprecedented for India in terms of a counterterrorism operation. It's not always true that India has responded in a heavy-handed fashion. We saw that after the Mumbai attacks. There wasn't the strongest Indian response, but it does appear to be that India has over time escalated in terms of the severity of its counterterrorism operations. And I think India had two main goals with respect to its counterterrorism response. The first was to attrit the terrorist groups that are sponsored by Pakistan against India. That is to weaken them, to go after the training camps. And the second is to communicate a important message to Pakistan, and that is that it will not be able to sponsor terrorism against India with impunity, that India is going to respond in a kinetic way all over Pakistan. And I think that from the perspective of India, and I welcome other thoughts on this, but this is my sense, But the perspective of India was that the international community didn't respond exactly as they would have liked. And there was some disappointment among Indians, including directed against the Trump administration in terms of how Washington responded to Operation Sindoor. At first, the Trump administration basically said, we don't want to get involved. This doesn't really relate to us. We're America first. But then there seemed to be some criticisms and maybe some behind the scenes pressure on India not to, quote unquote, escalate, to restrain its response to the mass casualty terrorist attack. Um, as is the case with the Israeli response to Hamas, a lot of the focus was really on sort of the counterterrorism rather than the precipitating terrorist attack. And then in the end, what really upset a lot of Indians is that President Trump claimed credit for the resolution of the operation, that he, kind of boasted about being the indispensable player in resolving the conflict, or at least leading to a ceasefire. And that declaration is in defiance of India's position, which is that this is essentially a bilateral problem between India and Pakistan, and that certainly the future of Kashmir isn't open for international discussion. That it's India's, and that it doesn't appreciate um, being criticized or pressured to prematurely end a very necessary counterterrorism operation. And it's in that context, I think, that the Indian parliament dispatched to countries all over the world, including the United States, a parliamentary delegation
Yes.
in order to talk in the immediate aftermath of Operation Sindoor to try to better broadcast internationally India's position with respect to Pakistan sponsored terrorism. I had been following the news closely about this parliamentary delegation. And so when I got an email from the consulate, the Indian consulate in New York, seeing if I could meet with the the head of that delegation to the United States, Shashi Tharoor, I was really happy because I'm really interested in all of these issues: terrorism, Indian security.
Absolutely.
When I went to the meeting, I thought that it was going to be retrospective, if you will, kind of looking back at what happened to India on April 22nd and kind of a justification of India's response starting on May 7th in terms of Operation Sindoor. That's the way it was described in the media. So that's what I was expecting. But I actually learned in the meeting that the meeting was more important than that because I asked a question. I asked one question during the whole meeting to Shashi and my question was, well, don't you think that there is going to be more Pakistan sponsored terrorism? Because even though this was unprecedented in terms of the scale of the Indian response, in my opinion, it wasn't that big. of a response. I mean, in comparison to other counterterrorism responses, not in terms of India's history, but I mean, look at what Israel, the power of the Israeli response to Operation Al Aqsa Flood, or look at the way America has responded historically to terrorist attacks like 9/11. I mean, in that context, Sindor was kind of selective in its use of violence, so relatively modest. So I asked him, I mean, do you really think that the message has been clearly sent to Pakistan that it will be sufficiently punished for state sponsorship of terrorism? And he acknowledged that he does anticipate more Pakistan sponsored terrorism against India. Everybody does.
Of course.
And so, in my opinion, the real purpose of those parliamentary meetings was not just what was said in the media, which was to explain India's response that had already happened, but to gain international support for future Indian counterterrorism operations, which seemed to be inevitable. So for me, that was the most interesting takeaway that I had. I just want to add a couple quick points before moving on to the other speakers, and that is that Pakistan is a unique threat in the world. There is not another country that possesses like large numbers of nuclear weapons, or maybe even any nuclear weapons, that is also a very active state sponsor of terrorism. And although India doesn't like to say this so clearly, the reality is that because Pakistan has nuclear weapons,
Mhm.
it makes it extremely difficult for India to respond to Pakistan sponsored terrorism, because India always needs to be mindful that the stakes here are nuclear. And so India has to be extraordinarily careful. And frankly, it makes it practically very difficult to apply sufficient force against the Pakistan sponsored terrorist groups. And we know that historically, when Pakistan developed nuclear weapons in the late 1990s, its state sponsorship of terrorism went up. And
Yeah.
I think that there are very important lessons here, obvious lessons that I just want to connect explicitly to Iran. We cannot allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons, because Iran most likely will do what Pakistan did, which is to increase its support for terrorism, and it would make it even harder or even more dangerous, let's say, to respond to Iran's terrorist proxies, because Iran can hide behind this nuclear shield. And the last point that I want to make is I want to make some criticisms of the so called realist camp. Realism is a very important intellectual paradigm in international relations and appears to hold a lot of sway within the Trump administration. And the Trump administration doesn't seem particularly animated by the concerns that we have about the terrorism threat and Islamist terrorism. And I think one of the main reasons is because of the dominance of realism, where realists historically do not regard terrorism as an important threat. And realism also doesn't distinguish between the ideologies of different countries and groups around the world. famously it describes international actors as essentially billiard balls that are indistinguishable except in terms of their capability. And
Remember that.
I think that the conflict with Pakistan really highlights the folly of looking at the world in that fashion. Terrorism is a very serious threat, and not all ideologies are the same. We're not just dealing here with terrorism, we're dealing with Islamist terrorism. And it's important for panels like this to weigh in and to try to reach some of the realists in this administration who appreciate neither the severity of the terrorism threat nor the dangers posed by Islamist terrorism in particular. So I'll close with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I recall learning my political science classes and during my back in college about the same concept, and it just baffled my mind. And I'm so glad that you brought up that realism concept and how it really is so severely misleading. Um,